This podcast is brought to you by StarCharge, the largest EV charging manufacturer in the world, and is also a provider of residential and commercial battery storage and microgrid solutions. And Kempower, the reliable, quick, and scalable EV charging solutions for everyone and everywhere. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Out of Spec podcast. I'm your host, Francie, and today I'm joined by Max. Hello, Max. Welcome back to the Out of Spec podcast, and welcome back to America.
Hey, Francie, thanks for having me. Yeah, I just got back from an international trip where I spent 10 days in Kazakhstan, not for work-related reasons, just visiting some family. That's where my mom's from. And so it'd been a while since I'd been. But while I was there, I saw a lot of electric cars, and it gave me a lot of opinions and thoughts that I wanted to share today, along with some of the things I've seen about the EV market in general, Francie, because there's a lot of electric cars in Almaty, Kazakhstan. I can tell you that.
That's, really cool. You know, we take a very North American, European perspective of the EV market, one, because we're in, the US, but I love to take a global perspective. And I've brought up a world map here so people can see where Kazakhstan is. So it's, just south of the western part of Russia. So you went pretty far to get there from Colorado. So that I'm sure that was a big trip.
Can tell you it was not an EV road trip. So no out of spec motoring video coming on that. Just a lot of jet travel. It's still a long time. Took me about like a day to get there with a connection in Qatar. But yeah, really interesting country. Just for some quick context for those of you who don't know much about it beyond like maybe seeing Borat, Kazakhstan is, like you showed on the map, Francie, bordering Russia and bordering China. So that kind of puts it in a very interesting geopolitical space. And of course, we're not, international experts or politicians or any diplomats or anything of the sort here in the Out of Spec podcast. But I bring that up because a lot of cars in Kazakhstan, Francie, used to come from Russia because like Russia is just a bigger market, right? Kazakhstan, the total population of the country, I think it's about 20 million people. For a country of that size, it's not that many people. And so it's not really a big enough market for like European makers like Volkswagen or Mercedes to domestically make cars there or import them super directly. So most of the time they were imported through Russia. But if anyone's been keeping tabs on current events because of the sanctions against Russia for their invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, that has limited the flow of cars to Kazakhstan. So as a result, there's this big vacuum. And just one of those laws of the universe is you can't really have that for too long. So China comes and steps in and starts selling cars in Kazakhstan. And Francie, I saw a lot of Chinese EVs in Almaty. So I was in Almaty, which is the former capital, technically the capital now. It's more in the middle of the country. But what you need to know is Almaty is kind of like the LA of Kazakhstan. It is very much a pretty wealthy place, not really a place full of like industry, but a place full of lots of, before electric cars, there were lots of like Range Rovers and G-Wagons there. It's a place where people go to show off money. It's a pretty big developed city. And what I was seeing there, Francie, on this last trip I took was lots of EVs, and that really surprised me.
Okay, yeah. So this is an interesting aspect, like where exactly are the auto manufacturers that maybe we don't even see very much in the US, especially those of the Chinese manufacturers? Where else do they proliferate? Because of China has a really strong EV market because they have a lot of internal workings. They make the batteries. They've been doing this for a while. They've really been able to also subsidize EVs in China. So, okay, how have these permeated throughout? So I honestly just don't have a picture of what it looks like, but I want to know essentially, of course, if we're like, what are the trends that you tend to see, especially the size of the cars that are being used in this market? And then, of course, any notable trends or developments that you saw that might be distinct from what we see over here.
Yeah, so some general context, like you said, Francie, China has a big advantage in domestic battery making. So they're big in their own market, but also we're seeing, I believe it was Motor Trend did a story on like how big Chinese cars were getting to be in Mexico and a lot of developing car markets. And again, this is something in the US that we're pretty blind to because of our tariff situation, our relations with China. We don't typically allow Chinese makers to sell direct here, or none have basically taken the work around for tariffs. There are some exceptions to that. Geely, which is one of the big automotive groups in China, owns Volvo and Polestar, two brands that actually do sell in the United States. But aside from that, we don't see like Zeekr or BYD or Neo or brands like that, which, you know, maybe for many of the listeners of this podcast may be familiar, but to just someone, just your average Joe who's definitely heard of Tesla or Rivian, you may not have heard of that from the States. So those brands are just huge. I mean, especially in China, but in countries like Kazakhstan where they're uniquely positioned. And the interesting thing about the Kazakh EV market, France, is there's an import tax they have, just like many other countries do. So it's pretty high. To get a European car in Kazakhstan, like to drive a Mercedes, is very much a sign of wealth because it's even more expensive to drive than like in Germany or the US. There's very, very steep import prices. But there's an exemption for electric vehicles, which is interesting, which uniquely benefits Chinese EVs, Francie. Now, I will say there's exceptions to this. I saw a lot of Volkswagen ID4s actually in Almaty, more than I've seen in the US. So it seems like those sell well. Though interestingly, they had like Chinese badging on them. I think it was the Chinese produced version of that car. But I saw a lot of domestic like Chinese vehicles that had been imported to Kazakhstan, many of them being that Zeekr 001. So I can pull up and share my screen, show people what that looks like. But that's a model that I feel like symbolizes a lot of what I was just noticing with Chinese EVs.
Yeah, would love to see that. And I think that is an interesting part of things. Of course, countries have different policies, regulations for what they're able or allowed to import, and to see how that benefits or hurts certain countries along the way too. So yeah, I see that you're getting ready to share. So I'm also surprised by the ID4. I don't know why, but
Yeah.
it seems like it. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
There we
yeah.
go.
If we set
Okay.
some context, Francie, yeah, I'm surprised as you are, right? Because then, like, here we were in the U.S. Okay, ID4s are popular, but I wouldn't exactly call it like the market leader compared to Tesla Model Y or even like
Right.
Ford Mustang Mach-E. However, Volkswagen, Francie, for the last I think 10 years, maybe more, has been a big player in China. Now that's advantage is slipping because the Chinese automakers are getting very competitive, but China has actually been Volkswagen's biggest market for quite a while, much more important to them than the US. And so in China, Francie, they have been incredibly aggressive about slashing the ID4 prices. So it's like the equivalent of $20,000 there, last I checked, as we can see from this electric article. And that is some aggressive pricing. I don't know if they're breaking a profit with that. I have no idea. They're not offering that price elsewhere. I think it's just what they have to do to compete with Chinese automakers. It's really desperate times for them because they're really worried about losing the market share. But before we get it too off topic, that's ID4. So many of those in Almaty. But Francie, the vehicle that really, I would say, exemplified everything I was seeing in Kazakhstan is this. It's the Zeekr 001. Have you heard of Zeekr, Francie?
I have heard of Zeekr. I haven't seen a Zeekr though. I think I especially heard it when I was speaking to Martin Lee, who's on the Batteries Included podcast and runs his own daily EV podcast. And I think he was, giving me a global perspective as well. So what
Yeah,
did you take
Martin
away from
of
the
EV News
Zeekr?
Daily is a
Yeah.
great person to listen to on this. I
Oh,
defer
yeah.
to a lot of his stuff about China. Him just being, based abroad from us across the pond, he knows a lot more about that market. But Francie, yeah, Zeekr is an interesting brand. You and I, us EV, us, people whose jobs it is to keep up with the stuff may have heard of them. I don't think many of you have. So Zeekr is one of the brands in the Geely portfolio. I mentioned Volvo and Polestar. Geely also sells cars under their own badge. So there's Geely, and Geely is kind of like Geely to Zeekr is like Toyota to Lexus or Honda to Acura. Geely is like their mainstream, like kind of budget brand. Zeekr, as you can see here, is kind of this sleeker, more futuristic brand. There's a lot of crossover with Polestar, to be honest. I'm not exactly sure like what the delineation is. From what I hear, Polestar does better in the West and Zeekr is more of a homegrown brand. We don't get Zeekr in the US. I think they do sell in Sweden and Germany, but the Zeekr 001 is the first model they came out with. They first came out with it like 3 years ago, almost at this point, and yet technologically, it's still pretty darn bleeding edge. And it was only sold in Kazakhstan for the last year or so. They actually also sell a minivan, which I also did see in Almaty. But this, Francie, I want to talk about a lot because I was just blown away by how nice this car is for the money.
It does look really nice. It kind of, I mean, the design kind of calls for me to Porsche a little bit. So I think it has a pretty premium look. And so you saw mostly these ID4s. So in general, it seems like, I mean, you tell me, like, what was the the comparison of ICE vehicles to these EVs, and were they easy to spot? Were they everywhere? Do you think a lot of people are adopting them?
Yeah, it was really cold in Almaty, Francie, which I will tell you makes it actually very easy to spot an EV versus an ICE car because you can just look at, even if, nowadays on a lot of combustion cars, the tailpipes are pretty well hidden, but you can still see, oh, is there smoke coming out of that thing? Okay, that's a combustion car.
There you go.
There were some hybrids. So there's another Chinese company called Li that makes a lot of hybrids. But generally, Francie, I was just shocked. The reason I pulled up the Zeekr 1 is because I would say, aside from ID4, and maybe even more so, this was the most common vehicle I saw in Almaty. Now, keep in mind, again, what I was saying earlier, Almaty is not broadly representative of the economics of, I'd say, Kazakhstan or China or a lot of the world. It's a very, very wealthy city. Lots of international people living there, lots of very rich Kazakhs. So, like, we're in the class of G-Wagons and things here. The Zeekr is not quite that expensive, but it is like, I think, converting the US currency, like a $60,000-$70,000 vehicle. It's not necessarily cheap. However, it's really nice for that money. That's like Tesla Model X, somewhere between Tesla Model X and Tesla Model Y money. And Francie, I think this is a lot nicer than that. One, it looks quite sharp. Two, it had all these like features. The reason I was able to spend some time with one actually is because my mom's cousin purchase one of these. So he bought
really?
one. He's been really happy with it. But I've seen so many of them on the road. And it's a very well-appointed car. Even though it's expensive, for the money, it has lots of features going on. Frameless doors, they're automatically opening and closing. Like you can do it all from the screen. It's got Napa leather seating. It's a very premium vehicle. Massaging seats, all that stuff you would expect.
Okay, so it seems like a premium EV that is imported, that is still, you're able to get all of these for, it is expensive, $60,000 to $70,000, right? But you're still able to access all of those premium features, even with what I would think would be, at a premium price. How do you think they're able to make this kind of vehicle at that price point?
Well, one of them is just, I think, margins. China can make a lot of these components domestically. Now, Zeekr is more of a premium brand, so I think they are selling a little bit more upmarket. To be honest, I don't know if they're making a profit on these. Maybe this is a strategy of just having a very aggressive loss leader in the market out there. But the import situation makes us very competitive because you don't pay any extra penalty to import these into Kazakhstan. So it's pretty easy to go into a dealer in Almaty and get one of these and not be, floored that you had to pay 30% over what it is in other countries. It's actually the same price, which makes it really nice. And my uncle, when he bought his, I think the dealer threw in like a free level 2 charger and install for his home because he lives in the suburbs. And so he's like, oh yeah, I'm never going back to gas again. This is like 1/10 of the operating cost for me to run.
Oh, amazing. So yeah, I was thinking about, like, of course, if there's opportunity to take advantage of a nice EV at a pretty welcoming price point, that's great. But the challenges of charging, I mean, I know that we have challenges here in the US. Charging is generally a challenge, and you're talking about at-home charging. What was the infrastructure for EVs like? Charging stations, especially compared to, the ICE gas fueling station infrastructure?
Yeah, I would say I didn't quite see as much of that as I would have liked to. From what I heard, talking with folks like my mom's cousins and just other people that experience with EVs, it sounds like kind of like in the US, Tesla superchargers are maybe a little bit more well rolled out. I think Tesla was really aggressive about developing this early on. However, there are lots of fast chargers there. And the biggest surprise for me, Francie, was that there's one particular big industry in Almaty, which is the ski resort they have. In the summer, it's also like you said, mountain resort. But they have a road leading up to it between Medeo and the actual resort, which is called Shimbolak. And this is an interesting route, Francie, because it's very steep. It's this high road. And as of the last, I think 3 years, it's been restricted to only electric vehicles. So there is a gondola to get up there. You can pay to take that. But if you don't do that, you have to get a taxi that's electric, or you have to be personally yourself in a vehicle that's zero emissions. You can't go up there in a gas vehicle.
Wow, that's interesting. So is that just more of like an environmental stance that they've put forward there?
Yeah, it's environmental. I think it's smart too because it's this it reduces air pollution in an area you really want to reduce it in, which is this what's supposed to be a pristine mountain environment. So it keeps the air quality nice up there, and there were DC fast chargers up there too. A lot of them. It put a lot of like U.S. ski resorts to shame because they had, I think, like I saw 8 banks of at least 10 stalls of DC fast chargers and then several more level 2 charging. So I would say, it's not like half of the cars I saw in Almaty were electric. We're not quite at that stage in the adoption phase. So there was still not a ton of utilization. They didn't seem that full to me, but it seemed like it was kind of thinking ahead. So it seemed smart. There were, I believe, they were like 50 to 100 kilowatt units, not super quick, but I think plenty quick enough for that kind of environment where people probably will at least be having lunch, maybe skiing, spending a few hours. So it was pretty nice.
Really cool. Did your cousin who, owns the Zeekr, or were you able to actually try out the charging infrastructure, or was your cousin able to speak to what it was like to use public charging infrastructure there?
Yeah, so my mom's cousin was saying that he actually hasn't used it at all yet because of his situation living at home, which honestly, regardless of where you live, probably is the way it should be. He said he was aware that it was okay. The situation was decent in Almaty and not amazing in the rest of the country. So, like, if you were driving from Kazakhstan to Kyrgyzstan or Russia, probably wouldn't have an amazing experience of DC fast charging. We're talking about pretty large distances, potentially driving through mountains, very remote areas. However, in the city, I think it's fine. There's enough DC fast chargers. But just like in the States, I think the people best suited to adopting EVs are people who have access to some kind of level 2 charging.
I would think similarly, level 2 charging just really helps the ease of your car sits a good bit, charge it when it's sitting and take advantage of that. And you mentioned, of course, in the beginning, kind of government incentives or policies. Can you tell me a bit more of what they have in place in Kazakhstan to promote electric vehicles?
Yeah, so I mentioned previously they have that like exemption for the import rule. So that's the biggest thing. We've seen this a lot.
Yeah.
Obviously, the US has its own federal tax credit. Many European countries like Norway do. And Kazakhstan's version of this is essentially the import exemption, which is a fairly large one. And
Right.
then these other cases like that resort road where you have exclusive access only to electric vehicles. I'm not aware of any other big incentives, but I was just surprised that when you combine this, in the market for new cars, of course, you can always get like a used 6 speed manual diesel Volkswagen Golf, as is the
Mhm.
way in Eurasia. You can always get those really cheap. But if you're in the market for a new car, financially, it actually seemed to make a lot of sense to get electric.
And I see here you've brought up Lotus. And this is one
Yeah,
that I've seen. I've seen a Lotus. I think it was an Electra. Is that how you say Electra? Electra?
Electra, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, fancy name. One at a charging something or other, testing for some charging, but I haven't seen any in person. Did you see these on the road there?
I saw one and it was really cool. I didn't get a chance to snap a picture, but I like turned my head when I saw this. This is also a Geely brand. People may not know that famous
Mhm.
British sports car automaker Lotus is now owned by the Chinese and has, I think, to the chagrin of maybe many Lotus fans, released a very heavy Chinese made electric SUV. It's not really what you might expect from the brand. However, there's no denying, whatever you think of it, that this is like a technology leader. This thing has super fast charging, super fast performance. better around the track than a Tesla Model X Plaid, hands down. Much nicer on the inside, very well appointed. I think quite nice looking, better looking than like a Lamborghini Urus or a lot of those like hyper combustion SUVs. It's just a very impressive car. I think Kyle and Alyssa drove one like a year ago. Alyssa in particular was very taken with it. It's really nice. I think they're going to sell these in the US or have already started to. This is not a cheap vehicle by any means. This was just a cool like sighting I had. So shows you that like these are developing around and that like aside from cost and scale, Chinese automakers in Kazakhstan and elsewhere are just pushing the tech forward in a way that like even Tesla and other, companies that we may consider to be the market leaders in the US aren't really.
Yeah, and I feel, if we're not seeing it firsthand over here, then or you have to be researching and seeing what China is doing with their technology and how they are pushing, making these EVs available in other countries as well. Because I think otherwise, if they're not getting into the US, how can we experience them unless you're an EV journalist that somehow comes across them here and there? So it seems like, of course, you're in a pretty affluent city that they're able to invest and, have the nice EVs on the market, but there's also the really attainable ID4. So there seems to be a
Yeah.
range of options. And that customers are interested in kind of all along the range in the city. Do you think that customer attitudes in general, how influenced do you think they are by the presence of these Chinese automakers?
That's a great
What kind of, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's a great question because, like in the U.S., aside from the tariff barrier, I think a lot of U.S. customers are going to be wary of buying a Chinese vehicle. And the situation, I would say, in Kazakhstan was similar, where it sounds like people are intensely aware that these cars are Chinese. There's no ignorance to that, including, by the way, Tesla. A lot of people are like, "Oh, Tesla is the most American automaker in the world." Well, for many
Made in
markets,
China.
Tesla makes their vehicles in Shanghai, and
Exactly.
this is one of those reasons that. Elon, for all the spicy things he says, if you notice, he never says too many controversial things about China on X because they're very important for Tesla. So people are keenly aware that Tesla, Lotus, whatever it is, that those are made in China. And
Mhm.
I think, initially there was probably some skepticism towards that. Now I think just because of the sheer price advantage, especially again, if you're wanting to get like a newer car, like an ID4 or something nicer like a Zeekr 1, then in many cases, the easy money is just to go with the Chinese option, regardless of what you think of Chinese cars or your associations or connotations. They're just offering really darn good value. Tesla is interestingly more expensive. I know we've been talking a lot in the US about how Teslas have been really price competitive because of their eligibility for like federal tax credits and Tesla just, being just slashing all of its profit margins, cutting its prices in the US to ship inventory. They have been aggressive. They don't seem to be as aggressive, at least in Kazakhstan. From what the conversations I had, people were saying, oh, yeah, Tesla is still kind of a premium brand here. And when you compare, Francie, like a Tesla Model Y to a Zeekr 1, I think the easy choice, just vehicle alone, would be the Zeekr. It's a much nicer, more well appointed car. In the US, Tesla has the huge advantage with superchargers. But as we've been talking about, right, a city like Almaty, people aren't taking massive road trips. They're not really relying on charging networks. And generally, in Europe and Asia, the delta, the gap between Tesla superchargers and the public infrastructure isn't as big as in the US. So, again, from a US centric perspective, oh my gosh, Tesla is like the market leader. There, it's like, okay, I saw maybe one Tesla for every like four ID4s and
Mm.
three Zeekr ones. There just weren't that many.
Martin kind of echoed that as well because Tesla hit like, I think it was however many millions of cars sold, but in Europe, and it was surpassed later than it was in the US because there's so many
Yeah.
more options in other countries and other regions that aren't available in North America. So I think it's really interesting to get this insight to see what's working in other markets, how whether they're able to how they're able to price these cars really effectively, what kind of technology they're using, and then also the differences in customer behavior, all the way from driving behavior to what kind of EVs they're interested in and adopting into their daily lives. Is there anything else that you noticed that either was surprising or something that you would like to see over in our market in North America?
Again, I didn't have like, I think the perfect scenario would be to go there again and actually rent an EV and see what that experience is like firsthand. But just from the anecdotal conversations I had, I was just surprised by how, I guess, unpolarized the EV discussion was there. In the US, it's recently become like almost one of these culture war topics. There's a lot of politicization of EVs for one reason or another. And there, it just didn't seem to be the case. For people, like there was no politicization of the technology of like, oh, EVs are a left-leaning thing or it's an environmental thing even. For most people, it seemed to be a simple kind of cost calculation. The same we've kind of heard of in like markets like Norway, where because of incentives and other advantages, people just pick EVs on their merits. I think that was the situation in Kazakhstan. It's just, look, if you want a nice new car now, there's, a greater than probably 20% chance you're getting an EV, and that's just the way it is. And I think it's cool to see that. I hope in the US we get to a place where there's less of that like divisive rhetoric around it. Because regardless, you've been covering this on the podcast, Francie, the emission standards are coming. They may be delayed, they may be relaxed, but they're coming. Every automaker knows it. And so at some point, they're going to have to start shipping more and more EVs, and this conversation has to become more mainstream. And so it was kind of refreshing to see that, at least in a place like that, and I imagine a lot of Europe and a lot of Asia as well, people don't think of it as this like political issue or this kind of partisan divide, because it isn't. The technology inherently is just it seems to be where we're headed, with some roadblocks potentially along the way. But I don't understand why it's like oh, if you vote this way, then you're getting an EV, and if you don't, you're not. That just seems to be, from my experience, a uniquely US thing.
I I think that's an interesting point because that obviously proves that it doesn't have to be connected to either side of the aisle. And there are people on the left, right, and middle who own EVs. It really isn't tied to the way that you vote. It's tied to whether or not you want an EV, and then whether or not it fits your lifestyle. And people like them sometimes because they're environmentally friendlier, less pollution. But some people just like them because it's performance based. So I think it's an interesting balance of figuring out what works for you and seeing that over here. I'd love to see, like you said, less polarizing efforts. And whenever I have someone on to talk about their road trips and EVs too, and if they spend a lot of time in different places talking to people, if people are like, what kind of car is that? Understanding what their experience was. And there seems to be a lot of, positivity, but often as well, they run into at least one person who's like, well, this somehow goes against what I believe and is offending
Mm.
me, which is just an interesting topic in general because I don't think it has to be polarizing or politicized at all. Nonetheless, this is where we are, where it certainly is.
Yeah,
Which,
absolutely agree with you, Francie. One more thing I wanted to say before anyone writes in the comment section: the Zeekr One, because it's a Geely product, is actually on a shared platform. I believe it's called the like sustainable electric architecture, some trendy buzzword like that. It's SEA. The Polestar 4 is also built on that, so it has very similar motors, battery, charging. That actually is coming to the US, though unfortunately, maybe because of the Polestar brand, maybe because it's for the US, it's going to be a bit more expensive for us. So it's not quite the no-brainer that it is in some other markets. However, looks very compelling. Interestingly, the Polestar 4 version, Jordan did a full video for that on our Spec Reviews, looking at a pre-production one, doesn't have a rear window. The Zeekr one did, but the
yeah,
Polestar 4 is doing some of its own funky stuff. But it shows you that regardless of, the inability of Chinese brands to sell directly in the US, they are finding ways to get here slowly but surely. So if I'm like an American auto company, Tesla, GM, anyone, like the writing's on the wall. There's going to be some really stark competition. Elon Musk even hinted at this as much in the last Tesla earnings call. He was basically saying, look, if China figures out a way to sell in the US, we will be in trouble. And that's Tesla, who many people consider to be, again, the leader in EVs. So that just shows you where things are going and what's to come. So super interesting to follow.
it is really interesting. And we've been talking about legacy automakers as they move into the EV space and continuously run into issues and announce delays and divestments. If this kind of competition came in, I just can't imagine how, if they don't solve their issues right now, how much of a problem that would prove them trying to go into this space with, new regulation coming in that all new EV sales by a certain date, 2035, are going to have, or all new car sales are going to have to be electric. You can buy used,
Mhm.
but like you said, there's a lot of EPA environmental regulations that are coming in, and whether or not you like it, you're going to have to get on board. And so that does make me think of just how this space is going to shift. So I appreciate also your newfound global perspective for specifically this region. And yeah, thank you. It sounds like you had an interesting trip and saw a cool part of the world, and of course had your EV lens on when you were there. It's
Always
inevitable.
have to. Yeah. But I can tell everyone Kazakhstan, it's a great beautiful country. So go and visit it if you want to. And lots of great stuff going on there besides EVs. So much good food. But yeah,
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Max. I would love to try some food. I don't think I've ever had Kazakhstan cuisine.
a lot like Turkish food if you ever had that. Just so many like I don't know, lots of fatty meats and rice and breads. Oh my gosh, the carbs, it's just insane. But a lot,
Mm.
a lot of yummy stuff.
You're making me hungry. Thank you, Max, for coming on to the Out of Spec podcast to fill us in about this. I'd love to know what other where other people have been around the world and what kind of EVs they have seen or trends they have seen. In some countries it's just the small EVs that get around, like the Fiat 500e. Sometimes, it's the bigger ones. So what do you see? What would you like to see in the US? What do you think about the future of the market if China does figure out more and more ways to get their EVs over here? What will that competition look like? It's a big discussion, a lot of unknowns that we'll just have to see. But like you say, Max, there is some writing on the wall. There's definitely some things to be considering if you're an auto manufacturer in the world today making electric vehicles.
A lot to look out for.
Thanks everyone for plugging in for this global episode of the Out of Spec podcast. We will see you next time on the next one. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.